Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 288, Aljamain Sterling defeated Henry Cejudo in the main event to retain his bantamweight title, and I believe that UFC 288 was effectively the end of Henry Cejudo's career, and I also believe there is a strong case to be made that Henry Cejudo ruined his own career. We're going to discuss that in this video. We're going to discuss what's next for Henry Cejudo if he does decide to continue to fight in the UFC, and we're also going to talk about a path to a career resurgence for Henry Cejudo where he can effectively end his UFC career on a high note if he does continue to fight. And we're also going to talk about, there was something that I saw Henry Cejudo's coach mention on the MMA Hour that was an outright lie, and we're also going to discuss that in this video. So quickly recapping UFC 288, because this was kind of a controversial split decision. I don't really believe this fight was all that controversial. I do believe it was close. I had no problem with the fight going either way. But the main controversy of UFC 288 was one of the judges that gave the fight to Aljamain Sterling. Derek Clearly gave Aljamain Sterling round 5. If you correctly score round 5, which I believe was the clearest round of the fight, and it went to Henry Cejudo. If Derek Clearly gives Henry Cejudo round 5, Henry Cejudo wins the split decision. Now, that doesn't make the decision bad. That just makes the scorecard bad. Because you look at the fight, I believe Aljamain Sterling took round 1, round 2, and round 4. I thought Henry Cejudo took round 3 and round 5. 5 being the clearest round for Henry Cejudo. But you could make a case for round 2, round 3, and round 5 for Henry Cejudo. The fight was very close. It was very competitive. I'm going to go back and rewatch it, but I do not believe that this fight was a robbery. But I do believe Henry Cejudo in this fight, especially early, he looked a bit off. You know, there was positions that he was in where he was like kind of confused on what to do. Everyone talks about Henry Cejudo has a great fight IQ, and you had Aljamain Sterling laying on all fours in front of him throughout the fight, and Henry Cejudo didn't know what to do. And then also, I believe one of the biggest mistakes Henry Cejudo made in this fight was not using his offensive grappling enough, which has kind of been the case of his entire UFC career, is not using offensive grappling and top control, because there was moments in time where he could have kind of held Aljamain Sterling down, controlled him, beat him up a little bit, and eked out rounds that way. And also in the first round, the first like minute and a half, he got an easy takedown on Aljamain Sterling, but he never prioritized the control against Aljamain Sterling. But nonetheless, Aljamain Sterling wins. He defends the bantamweight title. It's not so controversial, you know, where everyone thinks Henry Cejudo won, to the point where the UFC is going to do an immediate rematch. So now Henry Cejudo's kind of back to the drawing board. So what is he going to do next? And this got me thinking, what's next for Henry Cejudo? But then it got me thinking about the Francis Ngannou situation, because Francis Ngannou and Henry Cejudo were in kind of similar situations. I know that sounds crazy. I'm going to explain it. But Francis Ngannou, for those of you who don't know, the UFC was holding him captive in his UFC contract. He was trying to fight it out. Then there was the championship clause. And finally, Francis Ngannou got out of his contract. But he was having issues negotiating with the UFC. He finally got out of his contract. And then 2 months later, he hasn't signed a deal yet. Everyone is criticizing Francis Ngannou. Francis Ngannou fumbled the bag, everyone is saying. When we really don't have a clear, concise end to what's going on with Francis Ngannou to make that determination yet. But I do believe there is a similar scenario with Henry Cejudo where we can make that assertion. The same assertion that people are making about Francis Ngannou. And to tell that story, you have to go back and look at Henry Cejudo's career. Henry Cejudo obviously just fought Aljamain Sterling, but that's not the fight we're talking about. What was Henry Cejudo's career like before that? Well, he won the UFC flyweight championship against Demetrius Johnson back at UFC 227 back in August of 2018. This was a split decision win for Henry Cejudo. It was a controversial split decision. I thought Mighty Mouse won the fight. It was close enough where I didn't think it was an outright robbery going to Henry Cejudo, but I think most people, I would say it was about at 80%, considered that they thought that Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson won that fight, but that's irrelevant. Then he went on to defend his flyweight title against TJ Dillashaw, who was the current bantamweight champion at the time. TJ Dillashaw made the cut down to flyweight. TJ Dillashaw said, I'm going to become 2-division champion, and I'm going to close down the flyweight division. TJ Dillashaw also was injecting EPO into his body as he's trying to make that cut down to 125 and trying to kill off a division, which that's a topic for a whole nother video, but TJ Dillashaw, absolute piece of dirt, honestly. You look at, after that, he beats TJ Dillashaw, he KOs TJ Dillashaw, TKOs him, TJ Dillashaw complains about it nonstop. But what happens after that? He decides, okay, I'm going to move up and I'm going to fight for the bantamweight title. Well, the assumption was if he beat TJ at flyweight, he's going to move up to bantamweight and fight TJ for the bantamweight title now that he's beat him at flyweight. But TJ got caught with EPO, so then he got suspended. So it ended up being the number one contender in line, Marlon Moraes. Henry Cejudo fights Marlon Moraes for the vacant bantamweight title, TKOs him in the third round, wins the bantamweight title to become double champion. And then he gets a fight scheduled with Jose Aldo to defend his title. I think it was at UFC 249. And the whole entire world falls apart. World falls apart. Jose Aldo has to pull out of the fight. UFC scrambling around to make a new pay-per-view like a couple weeks down the line because they canceled that one. They get Dominic Cruz to step in on short notice, coming off a long layoff, coming off an injury. And Henry Cejudo goes out there, beats Dominic Cruz, TKOs him in the second round. You know the whole Keith Peterson story, smoking cigarettes, eating Marlboro Reds, and he stops the fight a little bit early. I didn't have a massive problem with the stoppage. I did think it was a bit early, but he TKOs Dominic Cruz, who is aging, coming in on like 2-3 weeks notice, and was off for like 2 years, I think, with an injury before this fight, and just stepped in to kind of help boost the card because the UFC needed him, and Jose Aldo couldn't get into the country. Well, the main key factor about this whole entire story is, what does Henry Cejudo do after beating Dominic Cruz? He gets on the mic with Joe Rogan and he retires. And I remember him saying something along the lines on the mic, "You won't have to hear me talk anymore." And Henry Cejudo retires, and a lot of people were caught off guard by this. I knew immediately what was going on. And this is where it kind of overlaps with Francis Ngannou. Henry Cejudo retired as a negotiating tactic. He believed because he had this cringy persona, and because people were kind of paying him a little bit of attention, and because he's 2-division champion now, he had this thought in his mind, and I think this came from his coach, but also himself as well. He had this thought in his mind, I'm a massive draw now. I'm a 2-division champion. I'm a former Olympian. I need to get paid more. And, you know, I'm usually on the side of the fighter when it comes to pay. We never got any specifics with Henry Cejudo in the UFC, so it's impossible to determine who was right and who was wrong. But Henry Cejudo, I think, you know, for people using the term constantly fumbled the bag, Henry Cejudo fumbled the bag here because he retired abruptly as a negotiating tactic, thinking he thought Dana White and the UFC were going to come running. He thought the MMA community as a whole was going to come running and be like, "No, Henry, you can't retire. You know, you're only 33 years old. You can't retire just yet. You're 2-division champion. You can't retire." None of that happened. So Henry Cejudo retires at UFC 249 in May of 2020, and literally nobody cares. Not the UFC, not Dana White, and not the MMA community. Nobody cared when Henry Cejudo retired. I don't know what he was getting paid before, but the UFC didn't come crawling back. The UFC didn't ask him to come back. That's what they did. They booked Petr Yan versus Jose Aldo for the new bantamweight championship. That's just what happened, and people forgot about Henry Cejudo. And the UFC and Dana White was pissed. They didn't care as much that Henry Cejudo was gone and not fighting because he's not a massive draw. But what they cared about was, oh, so he's trying to strong arm us. Dana White does not take kindly to that. They're very vindictive. And then you have Henry Cejudo sit out for 3 years, 3 years of his prime, and that's a key factor in this whole video here. Sat out 3 years of his prime, and he said, "Oh, you don't have to hear me talk anymore." All he did was shout from the sidelines about how he wanted to fight Volk, and he wanted to try to become, you know, a 3-division champion and call himself 4C because he include the Olympic medal. And there was no interest in ever seeing that. There's a few people who've told me, "Oh, I want to see Cejudo versus Volk." Volk would literally wreck Henry Cejudo. I knew that before the Aljamain Sterling fight, and seeing the Aljamain Sterling fight further cemented that. Volk would absolutely ruin Henry Cejudo badly. He would destroy him. It would not be competitive. He barked from the sidelines, looked for clout from the sidelines. Every time he trained with a certain fighter, he would make sure he was in the cage, get him and his coach getting on camera as much as possible. And essentially what he did is he thought, oh, eventually there's going to be, I'm going to stir up the fan base enough where they're going to demand for me to come back. And that never happened. And eventually Cejudo realized, and I think his coach probably realized too, well, we got to come back because otherwise, people are just going to forget about me forever. And I'm already getting old. And he finally comes back against Aljamain Sterling and he loses this fight. But Henry Cejudo wasted 3 years of his career. When he retired, he was 2-division champion. He was 33 years old, arguably in the prime of his career. He's 36 years old. Now he just lost to Aljamain Sterling. Where does he go from here? Because sitting out for that long, now he's 36. How long is the road back to a title? And, he said his plan was to beat Aljamain Sterling, then beat Sean O'Malley, and then challenge Volk. Honestly, Henry Cejudo could easily beat every single person in the bantamweight division. I'm saying hypothetically. I still wouldn't want to see him against Volk. That fight would never be competitive. Cejudo's in a weird spot where he's kind of a big flyweight, but a small bantamweight. He's never going to be able to compete with someone like Alexander Volkanovski. It's just not going to happen ever. Ever, ever, ever. I repeat that. And now he's in a spot where he's coming off a loss. I believe he came back for a paycheck. And what confirmed it to me, not that he wasn't taking it seriously, but I don't think his heart was fully in it. What confirmed it to me is there was a clip of him talking to Uriah Faber after the fight. And he said, yeah, I got some money. That's all he was thinking about. Oh, I just need to get a paycheck. I've sat out for 3 years. I need to make some money. And then he halfway retires in the cage again at UFC 288. And then all of a sudden, a day or two later, he's saying, oh, I won the fight. Now I want to fight Merab and then get a rematch with Aljo. And it's just, what I see here is something similar to what I saw with Kamaru Usman. Kamaru Usman, I think he looked a little bit off in the rematch with Leon Edwards. I thought it was a close fight. I thought it was a draw with the point deduction. It should have been a draw. But at the end of the day, Kamaru Usman's getting up there in age. He had that brutal KO, lost to Leon Edwards. And I just find it hard to believe that he's going to be able to rebuild himself and get back into position to fight for a title and win. And I think Henry Cejudo, taking those 3 years off, he wasted countless paychecks. If he fights twice a year, there's 6 paychecks he could have made. Also, that's 6 years of it's not 6 years, 6 fights of building your brand and building your star power and continuing your legacy. He missed out on all that. All to come back against Aljamain Sterling, who most people don't even like, who a lot of fans don't give him the credit that he deserves, and now you lost to that guy. You lost to that guy. I think one of the biggest blunders in MMA history is Henry Cejudo retiring in 2020. Because honestly, when he came back, I don't think he even got what he wanted from the UFC. I think he got the same paycheck, maybe a little bit of a raise to fight Aljamain Sterling. And I just think what happened was you had his coach in his ear. You had already him being very conceited and him getting attention for being cringy. And he really thought, oh, I'm going to make so much money. I'm worth so much more than I'm being paid. And he probably was worth a little bit more than what he was being paid. But he pissed the UFC off. And one thing that really cemented this position for me about him pissing the UFC off, the UFC didn't even want to do Aljamain Sterling versus Henry Cejudo. They offered the fight to Sean O'Malley. They were going to do Aljamain Sterling versus Sean O'Malley at UFC 288. Sean O'Malley turned it down. We found that out in the cage after the fight. It was offered to Sean O'Malley. He turned it down. Henry Cejudo got it by default. The UFC didn't even want to let him walk back into a title shot. And I remember Dana White saying at a post-fight press conference a couple, maybe 6 months ago, maybe a year ago, saying, oh, if Henry Cejudo wants to come back and fight for a title, he's going to have to come back and beat someone in the division. The UFC was not happy with that retirement, but Henry Cejudo wasted all those years. And now he's 36 years old, going on 37, and where is the road back to that bantamweight championship? And I do respect what Henry Cejudo's done, because now we are getting Aljamain Sterling versus Sean O'Malley, most likely in August or September. It's been speculated August at UFC 292. Henry Cejudo went online, called out Merab Dvalishvili for a co-main event spot at UFC 292 in August. I love it. I absolutely love it. And I do believe that's what's next for Henry Cejudo. And that was a perfect plan by Henry Cejudo, because one, if somebody pulls out of that main event, there's a chance they give it to Henry Cejudo. And I think if Aljamain pulls out, they're definitely give it to Henry Cejudo. They're not going to give Sean O'Malley Merab Dvalishvili on short notice. No way, shape, or form. If Cejudo pulls out, or not Cejudo, if O'Malley pulls out, Merab doesn't want to fight Aljo, so Merab's not stepping in. So if anyone pulls out of that main event, Henry Cejudo's got that spot, and he has a chance to regain that belt. But honestly, Henry Cejudo's only getting older. He's slowing down. And now he's got to fight Merab in a co-main event. Maybe he wins, and then maybe he hopes Sean O'Malley wins, and he gets another title shot against Sean O'Malley. Because Sean O'Malley wants to fight Henry Cejudo, but I don't really see that happening. Honestly, I look at what Merab did to Petr Yan. I know Merab's style isn't aesthetically pleasing. It isn't the best style to watch, but if he goes out there and just puts pressure on you nonstop and looking for takedowns and looking to grind you out, it's hard to get any offense going. So Henry Cejudo sat out for 3 years. He came back. He looked a little bit off. I think had he been fresher, had he not had the ring rust, I think Henry Cejudo from 2020 easily beats Aljamain Sterling. But that wasn't Henry Cejudo from 2020. So now he loses to Aljamain Sterling. He's probably going to get a fight with Merab Dvalishvili, and he's going to lose to Merab Dvalishvili at UFC 292. And then at that point, there's no road to a title anymore. Henry Cejudo is essentially a veteran stepping stone in the UFC. And that's what's going to happen. That is what's going to happen if he loses to Merab. He will be a name in the bantamweight division for other fighters to build their name off of. That is who he will be resigned to, which is why I believe the mistake of retiring in 2020 was one of the biggest blunders in MMA history. Henry Cejudo really messed up. And then you have his coach, and this kind of backs up to Henry Cejudo thinking he's a massive draw. You have his coach going on the MMA Hour and saying, oh yeah, the pay-per-view buys did 700,000 buys. When I heard that, when I saw that clip, because I don't watch the MMA Hour, I said, that's a blatant lie. Then you have Aljamain Sterling come out and say, we did 250K buys at best, is what I'm hearing from the UFC right now. So I don't believe Henry Cejudo's coach whatsoever. He's an outright liar. There's no way that did 700K buys. It did 250, which I know a lot of people are going to crap on. But for some reason, and this is a topic for a whole nother video, maybe I'll do a video on pay-per-view buys at some point in time. 250K pay-per-view buys isn't that bad. It used to be a day and age where 500K pay-per-view buys was substantial and was really good. But now, for some reason, people only compare pay-per-view buys to like a Conor McGregor who's doing over 1 million or Brock Lesnar who's doing over 1 million. And they don't realize that 250K isn't as bad as it seems. Because when you're comparing it to 1 million, it looks bad. But if you're comparing it to, oh, what's really good? 500K is really good. 250K is half of that. Isn't horrible. Isn't horrible by any means. But his coach, I think his coach is a yes man. I think his coach is an outright liar. I think his coach is a clout chaser. And I think Henry Cejudo and his coach effectively ruined his career in 2020 at UFC 249, retiring as a negotiating tactic. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.